The military design movement has emerged over the last generation out of many different fields and subfields. This revolution is about how militaries think, act, and reflect upon themselves and their confrontation with complexities. Many academics and military professionals have contributed to this movement. However, few are fluent in both the academic and the military practitioner world and are able to transcend boundaries and to move freely within both cultures and speak both languages. Ben Zweibelson happens to be one of these individuals, and he has risen to a position of prominence internationally through his impressive work with multiple military think tanks, research organizations, and military academia. He is aptly described as a rising star, but he is much more. He is a frontline leader of this movement. An infantry officer by trade, Ben spent 22 years in combined service to the United States Army. He was deployed 4 times to combat zones: the 2003 invasion of Iraq, the 2006 and 2007 surge, to Kabul in 2012 during the Afghan surge, and to the Panjwai, the home of the Taliban, in 2013-2014. In 2010-2011, he was at the School of Advanced Military Studies, the SAM School, and this is where he first came into contact with design. This is where Ben feels that he truly began his odyssey on design, which now has spanned 8 years. He's the author of over 45 design articles, international and peer-reviewed journals, book chapters, and multiple lectures and workshops. His passion is evident in this body of work, and his works have no doubt influenced many of us in this room. Ben is pursuing a doctoral degree at the Australian National University in philosophy, focusing on the design movement itself as an Anglo-Saxon paradigm shift for armed forces in the 21st century. Ben has also completed 3 other master's degrees. Today, Ben is the program director for the military design programs at the Joint Special Operations Forces University in Tampa. He leads a team of expert design cadre, teaching design to the SOF community, as well as NATO partners and other key allies. He's also done work with the Royal Netherlands Land Warfare Center, the Hague Center for Strategic Studies, the Canadian Forces College, the Polish Army War Studies Program, the United States Air War College, and the Marine Corps University. He's also working with other research programs in Sweden, in Poland, and with several police organizations in the United States. Today, Ben's keynote address will summarize the broad military design movement as it has evolved over the past generation to include language, methodologies, and educational developments. He will discuss how design might be useful for the Canadian Armed Forces, how we might benefit within this revolution, and how we can contribute to it. Tomorrow, Ben will also speak. He will close out our conference, and he will give a more cutting-edge discussion about the future of design, where it's going, proposing a whole bunch of new ideas. Undoubtedly for us here today, as members of this diverse community, his words will be inspirational for us to kick off this conference. So on behalf of the Commandant of CMR Saint-Jean, Colonel Bernard, and all of us here today, I would warmly like all of us to welcome Ben Zweibelson.
A little shorter. Well, thank you very much for that introduction. Just very humbling to hear those things. I don't know if my wife would agree with all those things. She'd probably have a few things to add. But thank you and good morning. I want to welcome everyone here. Especially want to recognize and appreciate General Cotton as well as Colonel Bernard for establishing this as a precedent and bringing and making this happen, because these types of workshops are few and far in between for our militaries, and it's very refreshing to see this type of our activities between academics and military professionals. And these are fascinating topics. I also want to mention, thanking Major John Benson as well, because I know down in the trenches trying to run one of these things as an action officer, it's a very difficult task, and congratulations on pulling this off and doing a wonderful event. So what I'll be talking to you for the next half hour is discussing really what is this military design movement in general. Some of you may not have that much familiarity with the military design movement or even design in general. And so in the next 30 minutes, let's talk about what does design mean? Why do military organizations pursue this now? What's different now versus what we were doing before? And where might the Canadian Armed Forces use design so that it benefits them in a future state? Next slide. And so, military design. I just noticed it's French over there. That's awesome. What's up? No, je ne comprends pas. So military design, what do we mean by that? When we say design even in general, what does it even mean? So what I frame it here is I frame it in a military context, but design at a meta level or above and beyond all disciplines, it's looking at creating what is needed but does not yet exist. And so that which is needed may be ideas, or it may be artifacts and things. It may be a combination therein. But whatever it is, it doesn't yet exist, and your organization needs it. And why does it need this new thing? Well, it needs it because it needs advantage and relevance in the future state of the system. Now the tricky part here is, if you don't have something that doesn't yet exist, are you going to recognize it? Are you going to know what to call it? Are you going to know how to use it? Are you going to appreciate that this brand new thing is really what you need in the future of the system because of the way emergence works? And the answer to all those questions is no. So not only does design have to do the impossible, but design has to convince the organization to accept the impossible. And I think that gets to the heart of how design is different and also extremely challenging for practitioners to utilize. Now, from 2000 approximately to present day, we're talking about 17 years, give or take a little bit. So it's about roughly a generation. There's been a design revolution. It's been moving slowly. We're going to cover where it came from and why it came from. But this represents a tremendous shift that's occurring, I propose, for militaries. Well, let's talk a little bit more about why this is happening. We go to the next slide, talk about some current events. So, little green men. What is different about what happened in Russia or in the Crimean? What is different? Because really, when you think about it, unconventional warfare has been around for a very long time. Right? We've seen this before, and many classical scholars will say there's not really anything different here. So the actions themselves haven't changed too much, but think about the effects. Think about the information. So today, this is a hyper-information age. Before any nation state can react or change a strategy or make a formal rebuke, this is all over the internet, all over Twitter. There are narratives and information and opinions and things shaping. And so what's happening is that ideas can change and alter at a far higher rate so that little green men are far more powerful, so to speak, than what they were before. Not because they can do more in terms of action, but because the ideas and information are so much more rapid. Next slide. Well, what else is going on? So we've got little green men, we've also got man-made islands. So the adage of boots on the ground has now been flipped, and now it's ground on the boots. You don't need ground if you put boots there and then build the ground on top of it. And so if you need an island, you can now build an island. So we're talking about in the future, because of technology and globalization and the rate of change as well as climate change, we now can alter the physical domains to benefit us for military advantage. And so with that comes not only shaping and changing how and what domain we fight in, but just the concepts associated with how we make strategy and solve problems and make decisions therein. This is different, and it'll continue to be a challenge, particularly for Canada, because as we look at climate change and we look at globalization, we look at new trade routes, new shipping routes, we look at fighting over resources in the Arctic, all these things will impact how we used to look at physical domains, and maybe how we need to start looking at them differently. Next slide. Social media and revolts. Now, revolution is nothing new. We've seen this before as well, right? But what has changed? So the Arab Spring there is a shot. It's riots. You have riots and you have protests and you have mobs. So you have mobs, but now we have something called flash mobs. What's the difference? We think about flash mobs, well, they're basically doing mob work at the tactical end or the ground end, but the entire organizing logic of how those groups collaborate, decide, act, enable, there's a difference there because of the speed of information, the depth, the scope, the uncertainty, because they're using a different organizational structure. So what we have today that's different than before is a small group of vocal activists can now, in the current environment, influence, inspire, manipulate, or enable at an unprecedented level. It's different than writing pamphlets and passing them around to help instill the revolution. Now, it's still some of the same processes, but it's occurring at such a faster rate that there's change here. And so once again, how do military organizations, how do centralized hierarchies react and make decisions and solve problems in these environments? Next slide. Lone wolves. So when we have lone wolves, which is a term I don't really like, I don't like that metaphor, but most of you understand and know that, so let's move with that one. There have always been rogue actors. There have always been copycats, anomalies, and outliers. But what's different today is the same thing. Is that the rate of information and the speed before, when someone committed a horrible act of terrorism, it could be read by millions or seen on the local news or the nightly news in a controlled, formal, measured way. There was a centralized control, the way the information was released and provided, right? Now, billions receive it in an unfiltered way, particularly not even from sanctioned news outlets, but maybe firsthand or a blogger or someone with nefarious tendencies. And so this is this hyper information age. What we have happening actually is we live in potentially a high information, low knowledge environment. Because when an event occurs, such as a nightclub shooting, you have a surge of information and a surge of coverage, but there's not a lot of answers on why. And so the knowledge will slowly start getting built up, but what happens before we actually achieve some sort of parity between information and knowledge? The cycle continues because now another thing has happened. The information cycle is done and has moved on before the knowledge has moved up. And so in this hyper-information world, we're off to the next thing. Right now in America, we're obsessed with United Airlines. But last week, it was Brad's wife in Cracker Barrel. For those of you that haven't Googled that, please do. It's very entertaining. Because we live in an insatiable information high, low knowledge environment. What can the military do in that type of environment? It's different. And it's going to only accelerate. Next slide. Refugees and war. Once again, what is new here? We've had this. We've seen this before. But what's different is the speed, the numbers, the saturation, the scope. Cultures smashing and banging together, assimilation, concerns of nationalism, concerns of all these things now have hyper tack to them because it's so much more faster that we're beyond saturation and we have no way of coping with these because all of our previous coping mechanisms, our structures, our ideas, our methodologies are not set for this rapid pace. It's set for slower amounts of information that we can deal with, we can control, we can provide some sort of prediction and stability. The stability apparently is gone. And so in this environment, next slide. I'm sorry, go back one. Sorry about that, I messed up my transition. So, in this world of this hyper, there's a demand now for a military design movement. So what were we doing before, and why was it working before? Now let's go to the next slide. Let's look at knights, because there's lots of shared history here. We have mostly Anglo-Saxon culture here. When you think about knights, you probably think about the great movies, TV shows, video games, all kinds of stuff, the climactic battles. What we normally don't think about but what's applicable here, who trains the knights? Who professionalizes knights? And when I say knights, we're just using them as an example, because we're talking about, say, all medieval or ancient or traditional or classic foot soldiers, infantry, take your pick, but we'll go with knights for now. Who professionalized knights, and how did that happen? For the longest period, it was a process where there was no doctrine, and there were no academies, not in the formal sense. And so there was this mentorship that occurred, apprentices. And so really, if you wanted to become a knight, how good a knight you were had to do with your skill, and how good a mentor you had. You might have had an incredible mentor, or you may have got the Black Knight out of Monty Python and the Holy Grail. So you don't know what you're going to end up with. And really, a knight who does an exceptional job and is a great teacher is really only going to influence a small footprint in their lifetime. And so there was no real professionalization in a modern sense. Everything was done locally, and it was contextual. Just as shoes were made, shoes and suits and clothing, it was all made by cobblers, and there was artistry. And how good a shoe you got really depended upon what access you had to some of the best shoemakers. If you weren't within a horse ride, you weren't going to get those shoes. You were going to get whatever the best shoe was that could be made that you could afford in the local area. And then the next shoemaker who inherited that shop may or may not be as good. And so there's a lot of subjectivity and flexibility throughout the entire age of militaries up until the 1600s. So in the 1600s, we have the arrival of, no, you can go ahead one side, that's good. We're tracking, man, we're good. So, in the 1600s, we had the arrival of two important developments. We had the first military academies that were established, which were French, and we had the first military doctrine, which were technical manuals. And I'm stealing from Dr. Jackson's greatly written Roots of Doctrine work here. And so Dr. Jackson makes an excellent point in his work that this is the dawn of the modern military era in terms of you now have doctrine, you now have formal ways of educating, and as this expanded and went throughout the collective, we end up with what we see here, which is we have West Point cadets in 1861. And so you have a professional academy, you have some form of uniformity, you have the desire to create factory-type bins of professional soldiers that can go out and do great things. And so you're losing that tailored special shoe cobbler, but you're gaining in uniformity, repetition, reliability, and the dawn of the modern scientific era. It coincides with the Industrial Revolution. It coincides with the process of generating a reductionist approach to reality using scientific analysis. And so the rise of the engineers that occurred in these military academies manifested in a lot of what we do in doctrine today. We are very factory-oriented. We have a very set process. We have classes of students that move through just like factory groups, and their assembly line they're put in as lieutenants, and if they make it all the way through the process, they pop out as colonels or generals. And I know I'm oversimplifying it, but when you think about the philosophy behind this, it's a reliable process that weeds out anomalies and problems and issues, and it creates a refined conversion process. Now, those professional soldiers apply a scientific method of analysis. And when we look at analysis, the fundamental core tenets are you make sense of your item so that you can reduce it in parts. And through the reduction of complexity, you can now determine relationships between those parts. At the lowest level possible, you can establish potentially principles or rules or patterns. And once you establish principles, whether particle elements or chemistry, you can then reassemble them to the whole in what sociologists call reification. We then apply those concepts to other things. So, with physics and chemistry, we have these things working remarkably well. Why not apply them to the military and to war? And so you have principles of war. And you can take any battle or any campaign or strategy, you can break it down, you can find elements and principles of war, you can reassemble them, and then you can use those principles of war to help you predict how to better win wars in the future. So this process of reductionism, this process of determinism, because cause leads to effect, these processes become the underlying engineering framework of all of our strategy and planning in an analytic-based process. And this carried us through World War II, all the way through the 20th century, and accomplished many great things, arguably. All right? And so when you look at modern military planning today at the operational level, when you think about the language that's used, metaphors, concepts, lines of operation, phases, centers of gravity, ends, ways, means. When we think about our foreign policy, our political science, nation states that are stable, unstable, failing, restoring balance. These things are all physical metaphors, and they tie back into this process of analysis. Next slide. And so what we see here is an example from American joint planning, but it's very similar across most all Anglo-Saxon doctrine and practices. Campaign planning, operational design. Not to be confused with design here that we're talking about, because operational design is established on these analytic processes. So what we have is we have a desired end state that's established in the future. We then freeze this complex environment so that we can reverse engineer from the desired end state with clearly established goals. We need to articulate our lines of effort. We establish our centers of gravity, and then we do analysis on those to determine vulnerabilities so that we can establish measures of performance along the way. This process has a great deal of attractiveness, if you will, if you are using an exclusive analytic process. And so for certain cases and for certain problems for the military, this works remarkably well. However, if you apply it to all problems, to include some of the ones we've talked about today that we are experiencing in this hyper-information world, this doesn't tend to work very well. And so no matter how much we force it, it just continues to fail and fail and fail some more. The issue is that we're not questioning the process. We're questioning whether or not we did the process right. We're not questioning whether or not the process itself is inappropriate for the context. And so, next slide. What we have here is a shot of a British World War I munitions factory. This is what I'll be talking about a couple of important visionaries and theorists. And so one of them is Dr. Russell Ackoff, who did systems thinking. And he offers another theory that the machine-aged man is really the same type of period I'm talking about, from the Renaissance all the way through 1945, with the rise of the computers. And so the machine-aged man represents what we best know and most recognize in our planning and organizational processes, in that the rise of the machines was important for humanity because it replaced human labor. So humans and beasts are less reliable and can do less compared to what machines can do in terms of labor. So the machine-aged man was able to do far more, move far faster, and be able to conduct war at far greater scopes and levels than had ever been done before in the history of humanity, for good or better or for worse. But the machine-aged man was soon replaced after 1945 by the information age, or what we might say is the cyber man. And so the cyber age is where machines not only do the work of the labor, but they're now starting to do our thinking. And so when you think about the cars that you drove in today on, your instrument panel is an example of that. You don't have to worry or think about calculating your speed based upon your rate of distance and doing math in your head, because you have a speedometer. It does it for you. And it gets even worse when we talk about GPSs and all the different distractions that we have. All the different instruments in the car provide you the ability to think less, because the machine's thinking for you. Now when we think about what this means for the military, is that in this information age, or this hyper-information age, machines are doing more and more and more of this thinking for us. So what does that leave for us? When we think about the context of the 20th century into the 21st century, and what has been happening with war, as we have gained more technology, and as first world nations have been able to spend more resources on greater systems and greater technology and have greater information, has that resulted in us winning wars far more effectively than since 1945? Or have clear victories only been special cases, and the preponderance of our conflicts have resulted in turmoil, ambiguity, gray zones, failure, or not achieving many of our strategic goals, and perhaps our population saying, you know, enough, it's good enough, let's pull out, right? But why? And we look at conflict after conflict. The United States military, from our perspective, in Vietnam, were tremendously technologically advanced compared to the Viet Cong. Today, the Islamic State have nothing compared to what the United States military and our allies have in terms of technology, training, skill, the ability to do what we are doing. Is it working? And if not, why? These aren't easy questions. Next slide. And so this machine age moving into an information age, there's the promise of the greater technology that we get, the more prediction we can get, and the more control we can get. And that over time, ultimately, we may be able to manipulate in an idealistic way every aspect of war. That's the promise of big data. And that is the promise of a purely analytic way of approaching warfare. And what I caution is that when we start getting seduced by this, this is where design thinking is most important. Because design thinking, as we'll get into, is about synthesis, synthetic thinking. It goes beyond analysis and it recognizes that objectivity is an ideal and it's never going to be reached, particularly in complexity. And for human beings waging war, what we have to do is do less analysis, recognize where analysis works in the special cases where it clearly does, and then once it moves outside of those special cases, we have to do something different. We have to reflectively think about why we're doing what we are doing. And in this example here, we've got the Strategic Air Command Center in 1961 for the United States. We were looking at preventing mutually assured destruction of World War III. And arguably, historians will say, well, we did a good job. We haven't blown ourselves up and the Cold War is over. And so I would say, all right, well, that's probably very true. But with that, the United States military and our allies and most of the Anglo-Saxon world, from the 1945 forward, went on a very long journey where we were trying to pursue this objective ideal. And so the analysis and the structures have entrenched themselves into our doctrine, into our processes, and into how we educate our professionals, so much so that it's almost impossible to ever even question them. And if you question them too hard, you'll be cast out, ignored. What I think is that over time, outliers and design thinkers began to break away at this, and that now there's a paradigm shift occurring. Not that we're going to throw away all of that, but that analysis has special cases, but there's so much more within complexity that requires different processes of recognizing problems and making decisions. Next slide. So I'd like to introduce a couple of just a few wave-top characters that if you're new to design, you should check out some of their work or at least some of these disciplines. And I only have enough time to hit about 3 of them. But when we talk about systems thinking and systems theory, there's a whole panoply of different interrelated fields. You've got general systems theory, you've got chaos theory, complexity theory, and so on and so forth. So if you just go broadly with systems theory, you'll be able to hit most of this. And I recommend checking out some of Dr. Ackoff's work as well as many others. So Dr. Ackoff is pictured here. He proposed a lot of great concepts. We'll hit one right here for the wave top. So he says there's 4 types of problems you can look at in these different types of systems. All right, so you've got problem absolution, which is basically ignoring a problem and it'll go away. So I'd say United Airlines might be trying to do that right now, and Cracker Barrel has been doing that for about a month and a half. Whether or not that works or not, I don't know. But for those of you that have children, this is a common technique by parents. Ignore the child and they'll stop doing whatever they're doing, hopefully, unless it's something serious, right? We do it all the time. So this is a valid way of solving problems in special cases, right? Problem solution, though, that is where we're looking for analysis and optimization. And this is the favorite tool for our military decision-making and problem solving. However, in order to do this, you need to have a couple of ingredients. You need to have a stable worldview. You need to have very clear goals from the onset. You need to have the ability to collect all the information that's available through all of your different means over time. And you need to be able to determine all possible valid courses of action so that you can provide them to the commander. And then lastly, you need to be able to rationalize all of that process so that if it doesn't work, you can repeat the process without questioning it, right? And so then the process of analysis becomes something that we just keep doing over and over and over to look for solutions that are optimized. Now those work in special cases. Well, what Apkoff offers is that, well, you've got problem resolution. So I don't know, does Canada have Dr. Phil played on the televisions at all? He's right, Dr. Phil. I think he started with Oprah, and he's a social worker, and he brings people onto a show, kind of like Jerry Springer, but a little like more tame. And so he resolves problem, and resolving them is where both parties sort of win in a good enough, but it's not optimized. And this is about trying to mend bridges and bring people together. And so Dr. Phil is very good at that. Now, resolution is different than solutions. What Apkoff offers is that problem dissolution is really what design does. So dissolution is where you've got synthetic thinking. You are taking analysis where it's needed in cases, and you're taking resolution where it's needed, but you're also taking something else. So to dissolve a problem means that it's no longer a problem in the future state, because you are changing the system and designing a future state where that problem no longer has the same type of relevance in the future state. It doesn't mean you're solving it. It doesn't mean you're resolving it. It means you're doing a combination therein. You may even do problem absolution. That's not out of the question. And so it's cycling through combinations of different problem solving as well as thinking about emergence, which I think what is important here for synthetic thinking. And it's also what is lacking in our military doctrine and our military decision-making processes, because we go to problem solution only. Next slide. And so Donald Schoen is another example of an important field that you should consider when you're thinking about design. And that is philosophy. When we talk about organizational theory, we talk about sociology, and this is all on that subjective side. So we're moving away from objectivity, where we're trying to predict human behavior, measure it, and establish universal tenets. When you move to the subjective side with these fields, you're getting into contextual or situatedness, where the anthropologist or the sociologist has to be in the experiment, in the study, where you're starting a village, for example, but you're part of it. And so your research, your work, and your proposals and your findings all recognize that you're actually part of it. You can't nice and neatly remove yourself in an analytic, cold way as an experimental. And there's a lot of value here, because the contextual or situatedness is important, because you as a military, all militaries, are deeply involved in whatever activities they do. When they enter a conflict environment, they are there. They are doing things and they are part of it. They cannot remove themselves and do pure cold analysis. And so what Donald Schoen talks about is going beyond individual learning. He talks about supraorganism learning, or how organizations learn, think, and create knowledge. And it's different because there's explicit knowledge, which we love to put into our doctrine, which is things that can be conveyed very easily. If you can explain something over the phone to someone who's never done it, that's explicit knowledge. Such as teaching a child how to put a puzzle together, or maybe a bicycle even, if they're old enough, right? You could do that over the phone. But could you teach a child to ride a bike over the phone? Probably not. So those things are tacit knowledge. And those are the things that the military struggles with as well. We have that in all walks of life, but when you have tacit knowledge, it doesn't fit into manuals. And sometimes it doesn't even get in there at all. And if it does, it's a faulty manual. It misleads. And so tacit knowledge becomes that which is gained through deep understanding and appreciation. Those that are masters of things. And we have master professionals, and master educators, and master politicians. But how do they convey their knowledge to the organization? And that's one of the challenges. And that's what design tends to look at, is how we think about our thinking, how we think about what we do. Why are we doing what we do? And so these are important processes. It deals with what Schoen calls reflective practice, or as you're doing things as an organization, you are also thinking about why we do what we do. This gets into our paradigms, or how we view the world. What is and what must be versus what we're not even thinking about because we've dismissed it from the start. And there's many things we do on this automatically, immediately, when we say, that must not be, because we deny it outright. And so the things that we are not teaching in the classroom, potentially, are extremely rich in new ideas, in emergence, in innovation, but they can never be discovered because they're not allowed to be talked about, because our paradigms have structured us towards specific conversations only. Now, the catch with paradigms is all paradigms do this. There's no special paradigm that lets you say, we can open it up to everything. Every paradigm's biased. It's almost like a telescope. No matter what you do, you're still looking through a small bit of the universe, and the universe is vast. What helps you here in design is to think about multiple paradigms, to think about social paradigm theory, which is something that Schoon and Weick and many other theorists have offered, and I recommend is a fundamental to design thinking today. Next slide. Now, the last key ingredient here, postmodernism. Now, if there's anything that brings out the garlic and crucifix at a military institution, it's dropping the word postmodern. This is dangerous, and I'll tell you my own personal experience, and I'm a fan of many postmodern theory. I have had to, I call wrapping the heartworm pill in the bacon on many articles, because the first time you try it outright, the editors are like, oh no, no, there's too many French guys in your footnotes. So what you need to do is you need to kind of obfuscate or Trojan horse, if you will, these concepts into the organization, because really, when an organization adapts some postmodern concepts, what postmodernism really is doing is it's dismantling and disrupting and challenging the modern structure. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, because they can mutually coexist. And what it does is it's actually rebuilding modernism into better and better and more effective and more creative ways. So postmodernism is actually healthy in many ways, although some postmodernists may disagree with that. Now, postmodern as a cultural ties into post-industrial as a society. And so if we are in a post-industrial or information age or hyper-information age now, then in terms of our cultures, we are entering a postmodern age as well. And as a military culture, I would recommend that is also occurring. And so why does this all matter? Let's go to the next slide. So what we've been talking about now up until this point, I'm at the 20-minute mark, is what I propose is the reason that we're here today is because there is a paradigm shift occurring. Because military organizations around the world are realizing, and this takes time, but they're realizing over time that we had previously, and you see in the tan section, we had a classical military movement. You know, that's the antiquities all the way through when you first start seeing doctrine in military academies. And that's still valid. You still have to have classical ways of doing lots of things. Drill and ceremony makes sense. Repetition makes sense. TTPs and standard operating procedures, those are all good things, and we're not saying that they're bad. But what I suggest is that the rise of the modern military age, which I propose and several others, occurred around the time that you started seeing doctrine in military academies, is where you also had that rise of the Industrial Revolution and the rise of that scientific analytic process. And so that's become to kind of dominate in ways that are unhealthy now in this post-industrial era. And so this post-industrial era is where we've mastered machines, but now the machines are also doing our thinking. And things are going so fast and there's so much information that we're now in this low knowledge area, and militaries are just unable to deal as centralized hierarchies with this complexity, the emergence, nonlinearity, and all these other issues that are bouncing about in our conflict environments. And we are expected to be just as successful in war as we were 100 years ago. We want to have enemies signing surrender documents on the top of aircraft carriers. Now, when's the last time that's happened? Will that happen with the Islamic State? No. It could happen potentially with, say, North Korea or Iran, but those are also highly unlikely. These things just aren't going to happen, even though we want them to, because that's the way things work. Now, the three past slides I showed you, so you've got systems thinking, you've got philosophy and sociology, and you've got postmodernism. And so these three new fields that emerged in the 20th century, they drove and changed so many other disciplines. And then over time, they've changed the military as well. They're influencing what is now this design movement. And what I suggest is the military design movement really is military decision-making and problem-solving in complexity. It is how we are doing in this information age or this postmodern age. This is us thinking about our thinking and recognizing that we live in a world that has machines doing our work and machines doing our thinking. And it's only going to increase. Drones, 3D printers, cyberspace, space, robots, artificial intelligence, Future wars are going to have a lot of those cool sci-fi things that we're thinking about, but they're probably not going to work the way we see them in the movies. Because in the movies, that's a reflection of today. We are mirroring on, in sci-fi, essentially, what we imagine we do now with things that exist in the way that we frame it now. It's not emergent, and that's one of the limitations of science fiction, I would suppose. Because the emergence really is going to be how those things actually play out, and it's going to be different, and it's going to be traumatic. And organizations are going to be frustrated, there's going to be losses in lives and resources until we can figure out and adapt. Now, adaptation is reacting. Innovation is taking high risk, rapid experimentation of new ideas in forbidden ways. Because making new connections and doing things that you just said, no, you can't do that. No, we can't even talk about that. But using multiple paradigms in design allows those new connections to occur, creates the freedom for that experimentation, and provides you the ability to innovate ahead of the change. You, through innovation, as an organization, can change the future state of the environment. Innovation does that. Adaptation does not. Adaptation is reacting as the environment changes or someone else innovates and you react to it. There are many examples of this, but those of you that were familiar with Blockbuster Video, and then you think about Redbox and Netflix, well, they had to react. If you had a Motorola phone in the 1990s, you probably don't now. You've got an iPhone. Because as systems change, you're either innovating or you're reacting and adapting. Next slide. So, just one quick note as well, since we're doing the overview here of design in general. If you are talking about military design, you must at least acknowledge that civilian design existed for at least 2-3 generations before the military even really started thinking about it. And so that needs to have some sort of weight when we're talking about where is the military going with design. So civilian-based design occurred after the 1940s, in that after World War II you had the rise of globalization and the information age and computers and all these different things were popping up. And so civilians with architecture and engineering and art and different fields were more open to some of these processes. Arguably, and this is an area of a great research topic for somebody who wants to really dive into this, but I think it's very interesting that the military kind of shied away from this in the 1960s and 70s, just when civilian industry was looking at this and looking at design and empathy and different types of concepts. And what I would propose maybe is that we were so enamored with the analytic approaches and the rise of technology that you have examples such as General Westmoreland in 1968 saying that he envisioned a future after Vietnam of total battlefield omnipotence. He was quoted as saying that. And that's a great quote because that's what we really thought we could do. So we were moving in a different direction as a military, while the civilian industry was moving in this direction. And so you have pictured there the Stanford Design School model, which emerged in the 90s, but really its origins are from the 60s, 70s, and 80s in various forms. And some of it comes from systems theory, like you saw, and some of it comes from sociology and philosophy as well. And postmodernism, I would say, also influenced these. There's also different models like ADDIE, Agile, waterfalls, all different types that you may have run into. So that's definitely worth looking at. The Science of the Artificial is also a great founding book on this type of movement from 1969, from Simon. Next slide. I will very briefly touch on this because I know Philippe will be talking far more extensively about the Israeli Defense Force. However, talking about design movements, Shimon Nave and the Israeli Defense Force, Shimon Nave was the first military innovator in design. Now, there were others before him, arguably, and I would say John Boyd, with his OODA loop and creation and destruction, is a great example of I would say, one of the first postmodern thinkers in the 1980s. But John Boyd didn't do what Shimon Nave was able to do, which was engineer and implement an entire design movement that changed how his military, albeit temporarily, approached problem solving and decision making. And so systemic operational design for the Israeli Defense Force was implemented prior to the Hezbollah war, and there's a great series of topics and discussions on whether and how that occurred and what transpired. But for the purposes here, in a 30-minute brief, the Israelis were the first, and it was profound what they did. And I think the context of what Israel was facing in that time period is indicative of why they were the first ones to do it. The United States and Australia followed second, and it was because we were in Iraq. And so when you think about it, when a military is down and suffering in a complex environment and things aren't working, that may be those conditions you need to create these types of openness where you say, well, let's question how we do analysis. Let's look at this design. What is this really doing? How is this helping us? So I think that perhaps failure has to be accompanied with innovation. Next slide. Very briefly, this was what SOD did, and you can see there's geometry, but there's so much more in terms of it's nonlinear. It deals with philosophy, it deals with sociology and different concepts. You're getting into the rationale or the worldviews and the decisions and language and ideas and core values and beliefs. Or if we get into the ontology, or how we know how the world is, epistemology, how we think we understand that the world works according to how we view it. So these heavy concepts are all occurring in the background of SOD. So SOD was exotic, it was different. It was also very challenging and poetic. And so some of the things that made SOD wonderful also made it difficult to understand, teach, and implement. And so that created a lot of issues. However, next slide. From SOD came in the early 2000s when that surge was occurring in Iraq. The United States military, and I'll show the Australians on the next slide, but the United States military invited Nave and some of his personnel to Leavenworth, and this took off there. However, the United States went and took SOD, and because they wanted to apply it to our much larger general purpose force, TRADOC said, you know, we're going to do something that hasn't been done before, and Dr. Nave says you really shouldn't do, and we're going to make design and doctrine. And so TRADOC in 2008 charged the School of Advanced Military Studies to do that, and Colonel Bannock, as the commandant there, was tasked with creating a design chapter. Now they had already produced an incredible document, a 300-page art of design student text, which is still a great resource if you're interested in military design concepts. But they were told, hey, shrink it down, reduce it, simplify it, make it easier. We don't want to do SOD, we want to do something a lot easier and simpler. What they were really doing, when you think about it, is they were saying, look, we want to keep our problem solution methodology. We want to keep analysis. So let's just put design as step one and hold to the analysis. And so they produced, the School of Military Studies produced a 35-page chapter, and then TRADOC said, yeah, you only get 15 pages. And so in 2010, they produced a 15-page chapter that really was unable to do anything because it was impossible. And it had reduced it down and enslaved it to the analytic processes. That's where, unfortunately, Army design methodology remains today. It remains grounded in an analytic, step-by-step process that directly supports the reverse engineering of our campaign design and our linear cause and effect, reductionist, determinist approach to war. None of this is working except for in special cases. Next slide. The Australians, also inspired and knee-deep in Iraq, at the same period started implementing systems thinking into their doctrine. And Dr. Jackson here was a proponent and has a far greater understanding, and may touch on it in his position, on what adaptive campaigning was doing for the Australians. But it was very different and quite liberating when you look at what they're even doing today with centers of gravity and their latest development where centers of gravity in certain cases are not even required. They're moving away faster, I would say, than the Americans in their doctrine from this rational linear process and potentially opening up synthetic thinking. Now, with that, you can see here, this is one of the more famous graphics, although not the only graphic from it, but it's a adaptive action cycle, which bears quite a strong resemblance to John Boyd's OODA loop, or Orient, Observe, Decide, Act. And so the parallels there have some utility in that many researchers say that Boyd's loop, which you see on the right, is a decision-making cycle. And so you want to speed up your decision-making. And if you can decide faster than your enemy, say if you're fighting them in a jet in the sky, you could win the dogfight. But what the Australians offered is that the adaptive action cycle was a learning cycle. And that if you could learn as an organization faster than your enemy or your rivals, you could then influence and change the environment so that you can react as well as innovate and create those future states. So I think that the Australians, at least in their doctrine, were getting a little bit closer to the mark to synthetic thinking. Next slide. So where is this all going today? So the international design movement, we have the Israelis are doing what is a third version of systemic operational design now. and it's fascinating. It's much more fluid, and that's a whole other of a panel topic that we could get into. The United States Army in Fort Leavenworth, Army design methodology still lives, although I think there's a couple of stakes in its heart, and it may be moving towards something different in the next 5 years, hopefully. And I say that, of course, with my own biases. I'm an Army officer and went through SAMS, but I do think that potentially the Army may move away from that once they get further in on these design discussions, or perhaps not. The Royal Netherlands Land Warfare Center has done an Army design methodology like imitation, and as far as I understand, they're basically just implementing it at their major and captain level education. The U.S. Air War College, though, very interestingly, has developed a very cutting edge advanced design program that they're expanding for their next year. And I actually went up and helped them stand this up. So they're looking at how do you take design and implement it with operational level planning? How do you lead design teams, which is something that's just not taught anywhere. And then thirdly, they're looking at what is the role of the leader in design and how do you educate design, which is one of the more sophisticated issues that are facing military faculty today. So it's very exciting work being done there. Canadian Forces College, huge proponent. Dr. Paul Mitchell, awesome innovator, because he has, and seriously, he has done here something magical in Canada, and this is what it is. He brought a variety of military practitioners together and provides a hybrid approach to design for his students that is not done anywhere else. And I think that's probably the best possible way to teach design. And for me, that is the model that needs to be imitated by everyone, and it's not. So what you have here at CFC is unique, and it's special and protected. The United States Naval Postgraduate School uses a Stanford D model that they've basically tweaked a little bit so that it still works in an analytic framework. The Polish National Defense Academy just stood up a design program using the SOCOM design model, which is very similar to the Army design methodology. And then the Swedish forces, the Marine Corps University, US Joint Staff, NATO, they're all starting to do this, but they don't know what they want. They just want design. Give us design. Well, what kind of design do you want? Well, whatever you're doing. Well, what we're doing might not be right for you. You need to think about your thinking and think about what your organization needs, and more importantly, where you need to go. And so I'll touch on this on my closing 20-minute speech, which I won't be over by 5 minutes like I am now. But at the end of this conference, I'm going to provide you one proposed way of where design is going next. What is the next generation of design thinking? Because I think that right now we have all stagnated at these first generation design efforts, for better or for worse, and they're necessary. Just like the Model T Ford was a great first manufactured concept, but you got to get to the next model. And so that process occurs in everything in nature. So it's fine for it to occur with design. Next slide. So what's important here is how might the Canadian Armed Forces contribute? And this goes to what General Cotton said in the video at the beginning, asking how, for us for this symposium, how does design and systems thinking, how's it going to enable the Canadian Armed Forces, particularly across those multiple engagements where you have different governmental agencies, you have intergovernmental, you have interagency, you have different alliances, you have all these different things going on because we are so much more joint and so much more allied than ever before, and we're connected with technology and information, and we're in these hyper information complex environments. So everything's spinning so much faster. How are we going to use design? And so for the Canadians, recognizing all the limitations that Canada has in terms of resources, context, location, geography, culture, and recognizing that we have all these different changes occurring. What might Canada do in the next 2 years? And what I propose are some of the topics here is, and a lot of this is just, it's conceptual. It's not buying new things. It's changing how we educate, changing how we think about our thinking, potentially changing how we look at doctrine, and how we professionalize our senior leaders as well as our junior leaders. And so with design, experimentation must occur beyond our current frames. So I've already been beating up analytic decision making this whole 30 minutes, right? But I also want to beat up design a bit. What we're doing in design right now is still not enough. We have to get past a lot of the institutional barriers that are making design limited so that we can continue to expand beyond that. So, one military will do that. Nobody knows who it is. Could be the Canadians, could be the Americans, could be the North Koreans. Someone's going to do it. And it depends on whether or not that organization is open-minded enough to experiment beyond what is in your paradigm. You can't do that. You can't make those connections. You can't say those things. You can't confront those tenets of our doctrine. You cannot challenge those principles. Those are the very barriers that will prevent you from developing this different way of doing design. So, transdisciplinary practice and multiple paradigm awareness, that second bullet, that is key. If you're not doing that in your military design, you're probably not really doing design. Producing and sharing design research. Well, we're here in a symposium, so once again, this is fantastic. This is one of those ways of doing it, and not to steal Philippe's thunder, but there's a Journal of Military and Strategic Studies issue coming out in the first week of May that Philippe has wonderfully assembled some of the most innovative design writers and theorists in the world, and the entire issue is going to be on design topics, which is fantastic. That is the type of stuff that's helped challenge, and a lot of them don't agree with each other too, which is great. So that type of research and exchanging ideas and sharing is what's going to help propel at least Anglo-Saxon forces, I would argue, towards the next design evolution. Now, novel language is needed. I'm going to put that in there. It's okay to come up with new ideas. Now, we're not talking about buzz terms and popular phrases and memes, although those are entertaining. We need to have new language to describe emergent things that don't exist today, but will exist tomorrow. So once again, design is about creating that which does not exist, but is needed. And sometimes you need to create new language and new concepts and new processes, and you need to adapt your organization differently because of that emergence. And so the new language is something that normally is controlled by our hierarchy. We produce doctrine, we sign it off, we implement it, we teach it, and we argue about it in the classroom. Do you mean destroy, or do we mean attrit? Do we mean dismantle or disrupt? And those are good conversations in a certain sense, but they potentially in design inhibit the ability to create new language that is necessary, it's temporary, it's contextual, and it's needed at that moment, but not before, not after. And it's very, very subjective, and it's very fluid, and that makes military analytic thinkers uncomfortable. All right, the last comment on here, continuous hybrid combinations in education. So this is where investing in your military's career-long design practitioners is most important. So what we currently do across most militaries is we do short courses, or we do basically layman design education. Professionals may get a week of it or a month of it, or they might go to an advanced school. They get little bits and pieces. It's completely based upon who is your instructor, what did you do. When I went to the School of Advanced Military Studies, I happened to be very lucky and work with Dr. Shimon-Nave and have Dr. Alice Butler-Smith as my primary advisor of design, as well as Dr. Alex Ryan. So 3 of the most influential design thinkers, I happened to stumble upon them, I got lucky. But that's not the case for many other people. So the challenge here is, what do militaries do with lawyers? Do we send them to a 5-day course and say they're okay? Or pilots, or special operators, or doctors, or dentists? No. We professionalize them through very extensive, rigorous schools that are essentially peer-reviewed. You can't become a doctor unless you pass medical school. Now, we even take strategists and we send them to formal strategic schools, but not designers. Military designers are on their own because there is no formal structure and there's no long-term investment. And what I propose is, if militaries get serious about design education, right now you have a small group of experts that can help consult. But militaries need uniform design experts that are identified as lieutenants and are matured through a design education process that's deliberate and extensive throughout their entire career, not exposing them at a field grade or even a senior level, because that's just not enough for what we're asking designers to do. We're asking for really deep, creative thinking and challenging our organizations and transforming them. To do all those things and give someone a 5 to 10 day course or a month of design is just simply not enough. And we wouldn't do that with a lawyer or a doctor. And so I think the future of design education for the militaries is to expand this and to really look at how we're going to professionalize it so that you have almost as a second career path or some sort of secondary skill set, deep design education for your militaries that pays off when those senior leaders are at the division level, at those higher operational levels. Next slide. Let's just skip to the very end, because I'm over on time. Okay, that's good. On the left, you've got, I'm sorry, go back one slide. So on one side, on the left, you've got a merchant with a compass and a map. right? And so that is analytic decision making. So when you're in a special case where you have an existing map, you have your compass, you're still going to encounter, like a merchant, you're going to encounter bad seas, mutinous sailors, maybe some sea monsters, maybe some pirates. There's going to be challenges, right? So it's not smooth sailing, right? But you still know where you're going thereabouts, and in these closed systems, you can navigate your way because your organization has established a map for you to follow. That's really what doctrine does, and that's what best practices do. Now, in design, when you're confronting complexity, when you're in a new environment where things like social media and the culture and the context and the geography, things are changing and it's never been seen before. People are making islands in your AO, or they're attacking in different ways, or you have refugee problems that you've never had. Now, you don't have a map. You've gone off the edge of the map. And so you're like an explorer. You're creating a new map, right? And so you have to have some principles and fundamentals that get you there, but you are innovating and creating. As you discover new things like an explorer, you have to create new language to explain that when you come back to your organization. When you return from your journey, you'd say, I found this new island, and we've named it this because it needed a name and we created it. And so then later maps can be made. So the design process really is one of you are navigating and you are creating without a map, but all of your design deliverables do become maps later on for your organization. And so it's a process of synthetic thinking, enables problem solutions, and problem resolution. Next slide. And so this completes the opening speak. I apologize for going a few minutes over, but shall we begin with the symposium? And once again, thank you very much for inviting me, and I look forward to the panels today and everyone's participation.